Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our third day of this awesome workshop. It's turned out to be completely awesome so far, and I'm sure it'll get even better. So we have today Lillianne John from Duquesne University and Urna Chakrabarty from the University of Delhi. And they're going to talk about starting from vice, virtue responsibilism online. And I think Urna is going to be womaning the PowerPoints. Take it away, Urna.
Yeah, all right, I'll begin then. Thank you so much, Professor Matoba. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Urna, and this is my co-author, Lillianne. It's an honor to be here today, and we'd like to thank the ACEPS for this fantastic opportunity. So our paper is called Starting from Vice, Virtue Responsibilism Online. In a nutshell, this paper is trying to illustrate how groups see each other over social media and how, if we apply vice awareness and codes of conduct, they might be persuaded to see each other less stereotypically and in more humane ways, with the potential to learn and change and work with differences and so on. Our paper pits two ethical epistemological approaches against each other to try to find a framework that may help to ensure good behavior online. And Lillianne will expand on what we mean by good behavior online in just a bit. The two approaches that we compare are Kasim Kassam's framework of vice epistemology and Richard Heersmink's notion of virtue responsibilism. And we marshal the social identity model of deindividuation effects, or the SIDE model, to establish vice epistemology as the winning approach, because we find that it's better situated, pragmatically feasible, and leads to good community outcomes on social networking sites. So I will be starting us off with some background. Lillianne will take over midway to present our argument, which she primarily developed, and I'll jump back in with the conclusion. So we'd like to propose a somewhat dated distinction actually between IRL in real life and online, purely because, as Parcell puts it in a 2008 paper, the internet offers an unparalleled ability to create ourselves in our own image. It gives users this never seen before capacity to determine their initial presentations to others, a capacity that real life doesn't really give us. And the internet also permits us to cluster with those who have the same interests as ours. It allows us to easily create communities that signal who we take ourselves to be. And this very public, very social internet is a powerful new force in the manufacture of identity. And so this is where our paper takes off from. When online, we experience that individual difference is displaced by the exaggeration of social identities. And we agree with Parcell that computer-mediated communication via social networking services gives us very little access to the variety of personal identifiers that face-to-face interaction yields. And as a consequence, members of social networking collectives commonly perceive themselves and those from outgroups as representatives of a group rather than as individuals. And we also, so a bit of context, and I'll be voicing a constraint that we're facing here. So this paper really took off from my experience of Twitter and Tumblr fandoms. And so in this paper, we're looking primarily at such fandoms. We don't have the time to get super into that in this presentation, but we want you to know that a lot of this paper stems from that experience. These are mostly Anglophone fandoms of what are known as Tanmei novels. Tanmei novels are gay/fiction pieces by contemporary Chinese women authors. And these books have an increasingly diverse global audience these days. So these are transformative fandoms, I should say. And by transformative fandom, I mean that fans creatively interpret, reinterpret, or even reject the canon text via fan fiction, fan art, etc. And conflicts usually occur between different schools of interpretation. So the type of conflict that I'm most interested in is between pro-shippers and anti-shippers. So pro-shippers are people who believe that fans should be free to like any romantic and/or sexual character pairing. Such a pairing is called a ship. And so pro-shippers would say that real world morality shouldn't dictate who you ship, right? But their opponents, anti-shippers, would call for the regulation of morally deviant romantic pairings. And of course, moral deviance differs from context to context. And anti-shippers would call for the cancellation of people who like these morally deviant character pairings or ships. Now, the fandoms that I inhabit are intercultural in the sense that there's a diverse audience that's looking at translations of queer literature from a very particular cultural context, from a very particular genre also, the Tanmay genre, which has a pretty intricate modern legacy. And a lot of the conflicts that I've seen between pro-shippers and anti-shippers in my fandoms hinge on racist ignorance, they hinge on misunderstandings, they hinge on xenophobia usually. But like I said, we don't have the space to get really into that in this presentation. So much for the empirical basis of this paper. Back to theory now. And I want to take you to the model that helps us pin down a key factor in group behavior on social media, deindividuation. This is where we look to the side model for guidance. The side model, or the social identity model of deindividuation effects, was formulated by Tom Postmes and others. And it's a theory that explains the effects of anonymity and identifiability on group behavior. The model suggests that anonymity changes the relative salience of personal versus social identity, and therefore it can have a profound effect on group behavior. I'll explain that. So online, we are not whole selves. Lillianne and I say that online we are fragmented selves. We're not self-contained. We can't be seen as atomic nodes that operate uniformly or perfectly in online spaces. Indeed, individuals can't be said to have a unitary sense of self. Social identity theory, for instance, tells us that one's sense of self is made up of personal identity and multiple social identities, all of which shape our personality. Social identities usually become the basis for self-definition when that social identity is salient, such as when we are doing in-group, out-group stuff, when we're making comparisons between us and them. Moving on to group behavior online. So one consequence of social identity salience is depersonalization. According to Turner et al.'s self-categorization theory, depersonalization makes perceptions of the outgroup more stereotypical. But self-perceptions also shift. Oneself and one's in-group members become interchangeable. And so the individual also self-stereotypes in terms of group attributes. Depersonalization, therefore, transforms individuals into group members who regulate their behavior according to in-group norms. Now, what happens when we add anonymity to the mix following the side model? Anonymity and immersion in the group can enhance the salience of social identity and thereby depersonalize social perceptions of others and the self. And the side model tells us that this happens primarily because anonymity obscures individual features and interpersonal differences. It's mainly a lack of visual cues that causes this. As a result of the decreased visibility of the individual within anonymous groups, the process of depersonalization is accentuated, and cognitive efforts to perceive the group as an entity are amplified, as a collective, as a whole, as a cluster. And consequently, people will tend to perceive oneself and others in terms of stereotypic group features, and people will be influenced accordingly. So Lillianne will talk in more detail about this, but let's start thinking at least about bad behavior online. And by bad, we simply mean behaving in epistemically vicious ways online. We borrow epistemically vicious from Gizmic. So some epistemically vicious ways of behaving online would involve stereotyping. They would involve how, the principle of charity is all but missing online. But we would like to say here that extending a version of the principle of charity to one's perceived opponent in social media spaces, it could be called like a believe the best of the other person approach. Such an approach, though ethically desirable, appears to be unworkable in practice, given, one, the inherent limitations of mass interaction online, which we just pointed out using the side model, and number two, the propensity of SNS, social networking service algorithms, to encourage aggressive interactions. A small example of how the algorithm encourages aggressive interactions. For those of you who use Twitter, you may have seen that when you block someone on Twitter, you can still see people quote tweeting that person. So you can still see that person's tweets and their online presence. This is a design decision that is clearly geared towards generating conflict and resentment, right? It ignores the user's express intention to not see the blocked person. Just one small example. But this is where I stop for now. I'll jump back in later. Over to you, Lillianne. I'll change the slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Urna. So that was the descriptive section about what actually does happen when we operate online. My section is a little bit more normative, coming from theory, what should happen online or what could happen online. A philosophical framework advanced to the problem of how to place normative bounds on our activity online is virtue epistemology. We take up two papers that have to do with the nature of inquiry. First is Heersmink's 2017 paper, which recommends the virtue responsibilist approach while using the internet in order to improve our information-seeking behaviors. And second is Kassam's 2016 work on vice epistemology to provide a better model, given our quest for when we're operating online in communities for mutual coexistence and intergroup communication on social media. And that's our application of these two kinds of papers, which have to do more with inquiry and individual operation online towards group interaction online. So first, here's Mink. Next slide, please. This paper holds that the unmindful activity on the internet, one's unmindful activity on the internet, poses epistemic risks for acquiring knowledge, judging a valid source, and so on and on and on. We've all been trained by now in how to use the internet in an appropriate manner to find information that is not suspect. Heersmink takes the virtue epistemology approach to the problem. And just as an introduction, virtue epistemology is less concerned with the nature of truth and of epistemic justification. It's instead concerned with the cognitive character of agents. Next slide, please. A variety of virtue epistemology is virtue responsibilism, which deals with acquired or learned cognitive character traits. For example, curiosity, intellectual autonomy, and open-mindedness. Heersmink holds that virtue responsibilism is a more relevant framework for the online world, given that it takes the traits to be learned. The next slide outlines 9 intellectual or epistemic virtues, which were outlined first by Jason Bear, including curiosity, intellectual autonomy, intellectual humility, attentiveness, carefulness, thoroughness, open-mindedness, courage, and tenacity. Heersmink then explores how we should deploy these virtues and avoid the corresponding vices when interacting on the internet. Now, while that seems like a very useful model, and Heersmink takes that to be applied in educational contexts, how to train younger individuals in developing these kinds of traits when they use the internet for knowledge-seeking enterprises. But virtue epistemology, including the virtue responsibilism, has faced critique. So next slide, please, from Jason Kowal, on the grounds of having focused too strongly on self-regarding intellectual virtues, which lead to individual betterment. In our context of communication over the internet, we look at this critique simply because we want to have other regarding virtues as well. When we operate in communities, you need other regarding virtues as well that regard other people's epistemic goals as well in community. Further, Kassam argues that scholarship must focus on intellectual vices over intellectual virtues in order to better understand the enterprise and activity of knowing itself. So next slide, we take up Kassam's 2016 paper, Vice Epistemology, to argue that when dealing with communication online, it would be better to start from vice than from virtue, given the way that we operate and interact socially and practically in online communities, as Urna described earlier. Kassam's paper argues that understanding human inquiry requires a study of intellectual vices, so next slide, which are more important than starting with the virtues, given that we are imperfect beings whose daily cognitive operations are plagued by intellectual vices. He holds that intellectual character traits are invoked in order to explain the process and activity of thinking and reasoning. They are how we find and judge evidence, how we, quote, assess the plausibility of explanatory hypotheses, end quote. What makes intellectual character vices vicious is that they impede effective and responsible inquiry. Next slide, please. Kassam recommends taking epistemology as inquiry epistemology, where the focus is on the activity of inquiry rather than the value of its content. The focus is on being responsible inquirers rather than acquiring a specific set of traits that are virtues. Responsible inquirers have discernment. We can move to the next slide if you like. They can tell when they're in danger of being duped. In this attempt to improve inquiry processes, inquiry epistemology must include vice epistemology. Beyond being merely a component of inquiry epistemology, vice epistemology has become also an exercise in self-knowledge. When it tackles self-ignorance that prevents users from recognizing how their own intellectual vices impede their inquiry processes, that is, their access to knowledge fundamentally. Next slide, please. Kassam takes up the case of the unwitting conspiracy theorist. And we all have, at this point, people who we know who fit into that category, the unwitting conspiracy theorist, to illustrate how the operation of intellectual vice prevents the subject from pursuing impediment-free inquiry. Even being able to partially recognize one's own flaws would be enough of a step towards trying to overcome said flaws, said Kassam. Next slide, please. Thus, recognizing one's own intellectual and other vices is a fundamental form of self-knowledge. This turn also leads us away from the insular form of virtue epistemology that focused only on self-regarding virtues. With inquiry epistemology, we receive the support that we need from theory. Roberts and Wood in a 2007 paper note that this makes for a strongly practical and social epistemology. So returning from theory to its application, next slide, I guess, to our issue of communication between groups and users on social media today, it would be fit to outline potential epistemic goals for users in a tentative fashion. A reminder that this paper is written more for the average user and not the small minority of users who operate online with, let's say, proselytizing agendas. This is not for the main producers of misinformation or conspiracy, it's for the unwitting consumers. So what do we, the average user, want? Hopefully, it's to operate better as users in these virtual communities of our creation, both within these communities and between communities. So what does that mean? It means we want to be free to pursue interaction in an inquiry-motivated, mutually conducive way in order to coexist online in our variety and our multiplicity. And we've tried to outline potential solutions to the problem so far. Which is probably our last slide, making attempts to be aware and to be self-aware, taking from Kassam, while engaging online are our best bets so far. One must remember, as Urna outlined earlier, that the social media networks that we engage on innocently are built towards fostering engagement of any type. But given the way that we form communities online, it so happens that the kinds of interaction we engage in the most are inflammatory kinds of interaction. Feeding one's algorithm is the common practical response, especially from younger folks. Simply being aware of where one is can have an impact on whether one hits a reply or a like button at all. It helps to remember that this version of the internet is built to communicate that it, that is the space, is a holistic system that faithfully represents oneself to the so-called whole world. As we outlined earlier, this is not the case. We do not interact online as we do face-to-face. We are fragmented selves online, no matter how many data points we are promised in order to make up a complete profile. Thus, there are limitations to what one can know at all about others online and what others can know about us. And training oneself to be mindful of these situational factors would be a useful approach. In terms of self-knowledge and self-regulation, perhaps a good principle for users online, especially when acting in intergroup ways, is to assume deficiency, assume vice, and build conversation from there in a supportive manner. On one's own part, given one's limitations, one may be seeing only partially and impacted by the structure of the system in what one is aware of while online. One always has more to learn about the unfolding of real-time events and conversations especially. And extending this understanding to others might also be helpful, given that we operate in epistemically vicious ways, and recognize that others may have limitations in play as well. In that sense, remaining context sensitive would be helpful. Where possible, communities should endeavor to make clear these limitations as we employ and use different features to try and make communicating with strangers online easier. Groups should set up those kinds of codes of communication. Because the ones that we use in real life really do not work so well online across a global platform. So Urna is going to conclude now. Thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. I just want to apologize to everybody for the background noise. It was Diwali yesterday, for those of you who know the Indian Festival of Lights, and so people still have firecrackers left to burst. There's still like stereos playing music. I am so sorry. But here's our conclusion. Now, in keeping with the side model's diagnosis of how individual difference is displaced online by the exaggeration of social identities, we have tried in this paper to argue that there is a need to formulate strategies of online communication that proceed from the assumption that we operate in these de-individuated, fragmented, epistemically vicious ways online. As Lillianne explained, taking virtue responsibilism online fails as a strategy because, and we should start from vice epistemology instead, because intellectual character vices are epistemologically significant when it comes to achieving better interaction events, especially online, between average social media users, that is, non-extreme social media users. And now we have a bunch of questions that Lillianne would like to pose, ending questions. Lillianne?
Oh, I think it's much better if the folks in the room posed questions to us. I mean, I was just
Okay.
trying to think of like holes in our argument or things.
Holes in our
but
argument,
I'd like
yeah.
other people to take a stab at that first.
All right, great, cool. But yeah, thank you so much. I guess we're done with our presentation. There's just this one last slide, just something fun for you to take away from our presentation. We're not going to get into this, but yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. I'll stop.